So there are a lot of protests happening around the world right now for people who live in the US regarding the new presidency and all that they're seeing. And here's why. They see so many parallels and similarities to the beginnings of the Holocaust. It's scary, and I completely agree. Reading books like 1984 by George Orwell or The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler are very, very good books to read right now. There was a great post that had some infographics by Rise Indigenous recently, so I just want to uplift that and go through it with you. Please feel free to put in the comments any of the similarities that you're seeing. The first thing I'll mention before we get into these slides is that the mustache man actually was elected democratically with 51% of the vote at the time. Does that sound familiar? And did you know once elected, it only took him 53 days from the time that he was elected to completely change the structure of Germany's government from a democratic government to a dictatorship. 53 days. Let's see, what day are we on? We're on day 6, just so you know. In 1923, the mustache man incited an insurrection against the German government. Does that sound familiar? He was tried, given a slap on the wrist, became a convicted felon. And then he went ahead to say that the trial was political persecution and successfully portrayed himself as a victim of the corrupt Social Democrats. Mustache Man cleverly positioned himself as the voice of the common man, rallying against the elites, cultural degeneracy, and the establishment, who he all labeled as Marxists. That sound like the woke people today, right? He claimed the education system was indoctrinating children to hate Germany and promised to return Germany to be great. To solidify his base, Mustache Man masterfully scapegoated minorities for the nation's problems, exploiting societal divisions with an us versus them narrative. Many Germans took the bait. Mustache Man's party continued to gain traction until he became chancellor in 1933. He appoints German oligarchs as his economic advisors. He proceeds to privatize government-run utilities, solidifying support of the economic elite. With the working class divided along cultural and ethnic lines, they were able to shut down worker unions and abolished strikes. Progressives and trade unions were imprisoned and sent to concentration camps, and corporate profits skyrocketed while working class Germans lived paycheck to paycheck. Again, feel free to put in the comments anything you seeing. Mustache Man became a billionaire while in office. He knew that he and his clan of oligarchs could get away with anything and everything they wanted to, as long as they had an enemy within to blame, while they continued to rob the country blind. An easy target was one of the smallest minorities at the time. Mustache Man removed birthright citizenship of all Jews and started rounding them up for mass deportations for being illegally in the country. The German press, under their rule, highlighted instances of violence by Jews to convince the public that Jewish immigrants were a danger to the real Germans. Mustache Man wasted no time dismantling democratic institutions. Loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Opponents were silenced. The media that dared to question him were vilified as the enemy and Marxists. Mustache Man's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, bragged about how they were able to intimidate the media into giving them favorable coverage and didn't need to give direct orders. What media and social media platforms are doing that now, y'all? Mustache Man's regime and its followers collected all books they saw as promoting degeneracy on what would be considered woke today and burned them in large bonfires. They also burned books that promoted class consciousness. Legislation on book bans, right? And at the time, Berlin had a thriving LGBTQ plus community in the 1920s and even had the first transgender clinic. And Mustache Man and his people burned it to the ground. LGBTQ plus people were sent to concentration camps and forced to wear triangle badges. Many were killed in the Holocaust. Just so you know, there's about 12 million people that were killed in the Holocaust, 6 million of whom were Jewish folks. So there's about 6 million others who were Romani, who were LGBTQ plus, black, other minorities of color, the disabled, and so forth. And seeing how Jewish people were the smallest minority at the time, you could see why it was such a huge generational impact when they were the ones that were taken and killed the most. Mustache Man's crew also saw manhood as under threat by independent women who didn't rely on men. In 1934, he proclaimed a woman's world is her husband, her family, her children, her house. Laws that had protected women's rights were repealed, and new laws were introduced to restrict women to the home and in their roles as wives and mothers. Reproductive rights were severely rolled back, and doctors who performed abortions could face the death penalty. We seen that at all? Despite all of this, the German people didn't have a similar historical parallel to look upon as a warning. Most Germans never acted like the sky was falling. Most just went along with their lives as usual until many of their lives were snuffed out. By the time that Mustache Man's reign was forced to an end by the Allied powers, 11 million people were murdered in the Holocaust and 70 to 85 million were killed in World War II. That right there is the difference. People didn't have historical parallels to look upon as a warning unless they were, looking at Mustache Man's playbook, which of course he was inspired by the colonialism of Turtle Island. He has said that in many of his writings. But we have this, and we have the Palestinian liberation, and we have the colonialism of Turtle Island and multiple land around the world where we can see what's happening. We can draw from the parallels. That's why enough is enough, y'all. I understand that you want to blame this minority group, this, vulnerable group and so forth on why we got here. First of all, y'all need to look at data on how the third party vote was not the impactful factor of why Kamala lost. It was definitely the Democrats' inability to sustain the votes that they've had in previous years. And we can talk about the ways in which they've ran their campaign, but I've done that in previous videos. And at this point, I want to move on. We should all at this point move on. We've said what we need to say. We've blamed who we wanted to blame. We've theorized what we needed to theorize. We've said all of the things. It's time to stop this and unify. Because again, Mustache Man did all of this in 53 days. From the time that he was elected to the time that Germany was a full-blown dictatorship. Took him 53 days, and we're at day 6.